messages.
Yep. And the tomorrow we're having this. So send this with your kid. I, not my kid. I don't know why you have my phone number.
Yeah, you can usually unsubscribe. Okay, we're getting ready to start. Okay, and we are live. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nerd Church, the place where Christians who don't want to read the Bible like idiots get some help from the critical scholars who are also interested in not reading the Bible like idiots, and we talk to each other and see how we can not read the Bible like idiots. It's a theme. It's a vibe. It's why we're here. So, welcome to Nerd Church. Um, we're just going to jump right into it. This is the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So we are kind of finishing up our speed run through the ministry of Jesus, because starting on Wednesday, we will be in Lent, which means Jesus has been born, Jesus has talked to people, and now it's time to kill him. And it's also a time where Christians, especially ones that are working from traditions that do Lent and do Holy Week, are sort of taking this period of 40 days to think about their lives and think about their choices. And we'll have something going out on Ash Wednesday that will explain all of that and all of the funky Catholic stuff that goes along with Lent. But right now we're going to just wrap up Jesus's ministry with Mark and also see what the book of Sirach has to say. So we are going to get started. Yes.
Can I say that this will be the first time I ever read anything out of Sirach? Is what you said?
Wow.
So
Wow. Wow.
brand new world. Brand new world.
A whole new world. Okay. So we're going into screen sharing. Okay, and we're starting out with Sirach 15, verses 15 through 20.
Perfect. So, if you choose, you can keep the commandments. They will save you. If you trust in God, you too shall live. He has set before you fire and water. To whichever you choose, stretch forth your hand. Before man are life and death, good and evil. Whichever he chooses shall be given him. Immense is the wisdom of the Lord, his mighty power and all-seeing. The eyes of God are on those who fear him. He understands man's every need. No one does he command to act unjustly, to none does he give license to sin. And then we move to the responsorial psalm, which is Psalm 119, verses 1 to 2, 4 to 5, 17 and 18, 33 and 34. Blessed are they whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are they who observe his decrees, who seek him with all their heart. You have commanded that your precepts be diligently kept. Oh, that I might be firm in the ways of keeping your statutes. Be good to your servant, that I may live, and keep your words. Open my eyes, that I may consider the wonders of your law. Instruct me, O Lord, in the way of your statutes, that I may exactly observe them. Give me a discernment, that I may observe your law and keep it with all my heart.
Okay, and now we are on to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. Amanda, if you'll do the honors.
All right. Brothers and sisters, we speak a wisdom to those who are mature, not a wisdom of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away. Rather, we speak God's wisdom, mysterious, hidden, which God predetermined before the ages for our glory, and which none of the rulers of this age knew. For if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, and what has not entered the human heart, what God has prepared for those who love him. This God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit scrutinizes everything, even the depths of God.
And then the gospel is Matthew 5:17 through 37.
Okay. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard it said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raka,' will be answerable to the Sanhedrin. And whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there recall that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there at the altar. Go first and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Settle with your opponent quickly while on the way to court. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge. And the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, amen, I say to you, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. For if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body go into Gehenna. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife must give her a bill of divorce.' But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to your ancestors, 'Do not take a false oath, but make good to the Lord all that you vow.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, not by heaven, for it is God's throne, not by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for if you cannot make a single hair black or white, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Anything more is from the evil one." That was
Okay.
a lot.
But
I said that was a lot.
yeah, that was kind of a lot, and I kind of feel like the end of the gospel, sort of like, and then Jesus dropped the mic. It's kind of a great it's kind of a great, punchy end. And I think, it's obvious what all of these things are doing together, as we're getting to head into Lent. It's sort of like, okay, now it's time to get down to business, right? These are the kind of ethical demands that are being asked of people. This is what's in Sirach, this is what's in Paul, this is what's in the Gospels, this is like what you're expected to do. You knew what you were getting into when you signed up, so don't complain. um and there's a lot going on there, and and some of what's going on there is is related to very specifically Catholic readings of these passages, especially Matthew, that we'll kind of get into piece by piece. But first, Aldo is going to break down Sirach for us because Amanda is not used to a Bible that includes him. So maybe you can start by just explaining who is Sirach and why isn't he in all the Bibles?
Sure. So this is one of the. So it's interesting the history about this book. First, it was a book from the Hellenistic period. It was written by a priest called Jesus ben Sirach or Joshua, his more common Jewish name. And it is said in the preface to this book that it was later translated by his grandson into Greek. So the original was written in Hebrew, and we even find some scattered fragments about this from this book in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the region near Masada, and in the Cairo Geniza in medieval Egypt. So
now, when you
Mhm.
say the Hellenistic period, just for the benefit of people who aren't as up on their timeline, we're talking about basically after Alexander the Great, or yeah, so we're talking about sort of after Alexander the Great has kind of spread his empire into kind of throughout the Mediterranean. Is that am I right as far as where we are in the time period?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's of course much. So Alexander is much earlier than this because his book is from around the 2nd century BC, and
Okay.
Alexander is from the late 4th century BC.
Okay, yeah. That was why I was checking, because I'm used to thinking of like Hellenistic period starting like Alexander the Great. So when we're talking about Hellenistic period here, it's more like 2nd century BCE onward.
Yeah, just for the book,
Okay.
because the Hellenistic period does start with Alexander. So
Okay.
we got the
Okay.
Maccabees trying to fight this Seleucid and Greek influence. But yeah, that's exactly the same period of time.
Okay. Yeah. It's always I always like to clear up time periods because, different things mean different things in different places too.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So what else should I tell you about the book? Well, it is considered canonical by the Catholics. I'm not sure if the Abyssinian Church, the Ethiopian Church,
Yeah,
yes,
they include Sirach also. They
okay,
pretty much include they include
everything.
everything that the Ethiopian Tewahedo Church, Orthodox Tewahedo Church, includes everything that the Catholics consider canon, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that we don't, because they have the biggest canon.
Right. Let's say they went a step further in the
Yeah,
all-inclusive canon.
yeah, exactly. See, the Protestant canon is too small, and the Ethiopian canon is too big, and the Catholic canon is just right. um so basically so would it be fair to summarize it by saying that Sirach ultimately doesn't make it into the Jewish canon because he's too late?
Well, it's actually interesting because despite it was not included in the Jewish canon, you can find quotations from the book in rabbinic literature. So the rabbis, in some sense, thought the book was of some value, but I'm not sure why they didn't keep it. So I was trying to make sense of it, and I sometimes think that since it it came from a priestly circle because it was a priest who wrote it, who authored it. I tended to think that since the rabbis descend from the Pharisees and the Sadducees were associated with the temple, perhaps there was this political
Mhm.
or even creedal fight between them, and that is why they didn't want to keep the book because it was of Sadducee origin.
Yeah. Which is interesting. And again, I think it kind of takes us back to this idea that's starting to um, that's starting to come out in a lot of modern scholarship that wants to talk about Christianity as basically being what survives of this like very like urban, very Hellenized kind of Judaism. So it's almost like you have what's going on in the second century. It's not in the second century, but in the first century. And then it's almost like it splits off, and you have the Pharisees become modern Judaism as we know it. And then you have this kind of weird Hellenized Judaism that latches on to the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, and that becomes Christianity. And I'm simplifying it a lot. And I think, and this is something that I've just started to notice in the scholarship that's popping up a little bit, is this kind of idea of like, okay, Christianity descends from Judaism, but what does that mean? And it's something that I personally just find really interesting, is this idea of how movements kind of split off and head off in different directions.
Correct. And the interesting thing is that it is not linear in any sense. So you may think of it as an equation where everything is just neat and tidy,
Yeah.
but it's actually not. It's there's so much. There are so many things we do not know, or we're not certain how or why they happened. So that's why scholars still have a job, right?
Yeah, exactly. And why it's probably, not going to be settled anytime soon. What exactly, what things exactly look like. And that's what I've always find interesting. Did you have anything to say about the song? Amanda's laughing at
So
something.
I Googled real quick. And I
Okay.
just I don't have time to like look at a whole lot, but this
Yeah.
one website uh which I just it's a comment about Sirach that just doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense. It says that one of the reasons is because Jesus never quotes it. That's why it doesn't get included, which I think is really wild considering there are other books of the Hebrew scriptures which Jesus does not quote.
Yeah.
So, like that's a weird criteria to make that decision.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think I'm actually gonna look this up later. I
Yeah.
didn't look it up
Yeah.
today, but
Yeah, Jesus doesn't quote it is kind of a special piece of post hoc reasoning, especially considering that there are other, well, I mean, like, famously, like the letter of James quotes the book of Enoch.
hmm which
So,
we also don't keep.
yeah, exactly. So it's like if you're gonna make like is it quoted in scripture the criteria, then Enoch is back in. Um,
The other reason was stated that it leans too much into you if you behave, then that'll reconcile like more workspace kind of thing.
oh, okay.
The problem with that is there are Paul, being Paul, leans very heavily into grace and like you can't make it without assistance, without like God's doing it completely. But there are other sections of the scriptures that lean that if you read them, by themselves. They come out more works based. So yeah, again,
Yeah,
not a great reason. So
yeah,
this is definitely something I'm gonna be looking into.
yeah.
Because
And,
now I'm curious.
yeah, because although honestly, I have to say I'm both like fascinated and horrified by the idea of a bunch of sola scriptura Protestants getting their hands on the Book of Enoch because yeah,
It's on the to be read pile, but it has not been
yeah,
read. So I actually don't know that much about the Book of Enoch, other than I
okay,
know that it is quoted in James and there's a couple other places that quote
yeah,
Enoch. And I
yeah.
know that because I have, consumed other media about various scriptures, but I have not read Book of Enoch for
Yeah.
myself yet.
Oh yeah.
That is on the list.
Oh yeah. At some point we should probably do a little mini series on like the things that didn't make it into the Bible because so some of that stuff it's like I don't know. I always read it and some of it I think, you know what? I'm really okay with this not having made it
How I
in.
feel about the Gnostic gospel, some of the Gnostics.
Yeah, it's
I'm just
like
like,
I'm
"Meh,
yeah.
I don't know that I see a good reason to
Yeah,
keep it.
yeah, it's like well, it's like people, it's like people will complain about Revelation being in there, and I'm like, okay, if you look at the available apocalypses, and like somebody was like, you have to pick one of these apocalypses to put in the Bible. Honest to
Is it
God,
the least weird?
I'm picking Revelation every time.
Really? Really? Because I have always had my beef with Revelations.
Well, no, I'm not saying that I don't. I'm not saying that I don't have beef with Revelation. What I'm saying is that if I'm sitting there in the year 300 and somebody says to me, Katie, these are the like however many available apocalypses that are going to go at the end of the Bible, pick the one that you want to be canon. I'm
Uh-huh.
picking John's Revelation. If you had to have one, if you
I,
had to have one, I'm going with Revelation.
I I guess I should read the other ones to see
Yeah,
how
yeah,
much I
yeah,
don't hate. Hate is a strong word. Okay, how much I am
yeah,
bothered by Revelation,
yeah,
or am I bothered by the interpretations of
yeah,
Revelation?
yeah. Because like Revelation, like Revelation by itself is okay. I think it's more what people do with it. And besides, Revelation gives us the woman clothed with the sun and the moon at her feet. And, how much art do we not have without the woman clothed with the sun and the moon at her feet? I mean, just saying. Okay, but we are not here to talk about Revelation. We are here to talk about, I don't know, although, did you have anything to say about Psalms?
I would like to go back to Sirach
Mm,
just to give a
please.
so it's interesting the way this little passage, this short passage we have here uh, gives us a some very interesting ideas about how the author conceived God. So it basically says, at least in my opinion, that you can do whatever you want, but just keep in mind that the eyes of God are on those who fear Him, and no one does He command to act unjustly. To none does He give license to sin. So you have free will. You can do whatever you want, but remember that God doesn't want you to act unjustly or to sin. So you better choose wisely.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this other there's this image about fire and water. So he has set before you fire and water, to whichever you choose, stretch forth your hand. And then before man are life and death, good and evil, whichever he chooses shall be given him. There's a passage in rabbinic literature, and I'm not sure if you remember it from the Merkava seminar, they were talking about this. So the Merkava is a like a mystic.
Pal, the Merkaba is the chariot, right?
Right. It
Yeah.
is based. So it is a mystical school based on Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel chapter 1, 8, and 10. So they mainly dealt with ascent to heaven, and in a sense, it was some kind of salvation, although scholars do not agree as to the details. And there they mentioned that engaging in this practice is as if you had to walk through a narrow path between fire and ice, not fire and water. And if you go to the right where the fire is, you will get burned. And if you go to the left where the ice is, you will get I'm not sure if it's the right way you say it in English, but in Spanish we say you also get burned by ice because of the extreme
Well,
cold.
yeah, yeah, in English, you can talk about something like being so cold that it burns. Like we don't have like quite the expression, but yeah, or like you get frostbite.
Okay,
Right. I
let's go
think it's
with
the
frostbite.
idea. Yeah, it is like you get like frostbite.
And that's what I have to say about this the Sirach reading. Then moving on to the Psalm reading. So this is an interesting Psalm. Um, Not many Bibles would have it, but if you look at the original Hebrew, Psalm 119 is the longest Psalm in all of the book, in the whole book. And it is particularly interesting because it is an alphabetic psalm. So what that means is that there's all the verses from that psalm start with one letter of the Hebrew alphabet in alphabetic order. So we have eight verses for each one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And so this psalm has a very long history, and it is even used in some sense as a magical psalm because of the alphabetic nature. And it extols the Torah in a sense. So you have all these 8 verses by 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, speaking about how important the Torah is. And it is always trying to make people think that they should keep the commandments, to be just, to be righteous before God, and that they will receive the different promises God has given to his people. That is in a general sense, what this psalm is trying to convey to us.
Wow. So like the scribe who came up with this psalm was like really showing off.
That's right. Yeah.
Like really, really showing off. Because I mean, like I've written like a little bit of poetry where just where you have to follow like a formal rhyme scheme or something like that, and that's hard. Just getting like the right number of syllables, but having everything start with the same letter and you have like the same pattern throughout the whole thing and it's that long. I mean, like, respect. Like that's hard, and like and also that's kind of like why I get a little bit offended on the scribes part when people are like, "Oh, the Bible was like just like a direct revelation from God, and you're supposed to imagine it like like you're supposed to imagine almost like automatic writing, where the person is just like sitting there in a trance, whatever God's saying." And it's like, no, like these were stories and poems and things that were put together by incredibly talented humans who were, you know, masters of their craft and were working at like such a high level that it's like you have to it's like, you know, the miracle is like God made someone, you know, God made some weird little guy who would sit there and be like, okay, it has to have one word for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it has to be this because this has to be the perfect encapsulation of the Torah. I mean, that's cool.
Yeah, and if we add to that in the during the medieval period, the scribes not only added to the so Hebrew originally contained no vowels, so you would have just the consonantal skeleton. But then the during the medieval period, the Masoretes, that's how they are called. They were scribes, and they would add vowels and punctuation marks or cantillation signs. So it is a superhuman feat to copy a Bible with so many signs correctly by hand at that period. You know, you even find mistakes. I usually find mistakes in modern Hebrew Bibles. So we're in the computer age, but we still cannot make an error-free Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, very impressive. And speaking of weird little guys, but I think that takes us to Paul.
Doesn't it always?
Yeah, because, you know,
He's got to end up back here.
yeah, we always end up with Paul. He's just a weird little guy. Um, and you know, and the thing that of course is really important about this part of Corinthians is this is basically understood by most Christians and certainly, you know, Catholics, that this is basically Paul's argument for the messages in scripture being timeless, right? So it's something that's written in a very specific place and in a very specific time, but what is contained in there is in some sense a message for all people in all times and all places if they're willing to put in the work and understand it. You know, and of course, you know, we've got, you know, Paul, you know, which none of the rulers of this age knew, or if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Right? Which, of course, also is very neatly talking about, by talking about the rulers of his age, is, of course, also a really subtle reference, not just to the Sanhedrin, but also to Rome. Because one of the projects of the Catholic Church in like basically after world it really got started after World War II and became even more important when things were kind of when the reforms of Vatican II were happening, where there was a decision made to kind of like look at, you know, 1900 years of increasingly nasty anti-Semitism and just say, we're not going to do that anymore. And one of the pieces of that was, you know, changing pieces of the liturgy and also changing the readings that were being selected to make it clear that modern Jews are not responsible for the crucifixion, and that even at the time, the crucifixion happened because of the very specific actions of very specific people in power, and that a lot of those people in power were Roman.
I mean, he did die via a Roman execution.
Yeah. No, that
I mean, right
yeah,
there.
well, exactly. And also it has the advantage of being historically true, right? And also now, since the 1960s, there's kind of been the freedom to go, oh, we don't actually have to let the Romans off the hook, right? We don't have to let empire off. We don't have to figure out a way to let empire off the hook. Instead, we can just say, yeah, the Romans were ultimately responsible for the crucifixion, and the Sanhedrin, although they were culpable to some degree, were also, they were an occupied, colonized people who were doing what they could to keep their people alive, because what happened in 70 could have happened in 33 just as easy. And so that's kind of what's going on with that piece, in addition, of course, to, Paul's everybody pay attention, really, this matters.
Well, he's also speaking to the fact that the idea of how sort of by the world standards, how ridiculous it is to follow some guy who died on a cross.
Well, yeah,
Like
exactly.
he's dead, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, he's
he
dead.
argues for the resurrection, but like from everybody else's standpoint, like your
Yeah.
God like died in this really awful, like humiliating way. Like,
Yeah. After having managed to accomplish precisely zero of the things that the Messiah was understood at that time by most people to be supposed to do, right?
mhm.
So, and that's why Paul's, speaking, of course, of, people who are mature, so people who are ready to understand this, new understanding of what messiahship looks like. Which, of course, and it's also worth mentioning that this section of Corinthians, talking about those who are mature, is one of the ones that shows up in Marcion's edition of Paul's letters. Because part of the whole Gnostic thing is this idea that there's a certain set of like super special Christians who are capable of understanding the real esoteric knowledge. And so for Marcion and some of the Gnostics, this thing about, teaching for those who are mature is just like catnip, right? They smell it and they're like, ooh, the mature. Paul's talking about the mature. Paul must be talking about us, right? Whereas the interpretation that ends up winning out is basically the idea that the mature are just people who are willing to accept Christianity. So
Right. When I read the passage, it struck me immediately as food for Gnostics, because there's this idea of secrecy, and there's even in the Greek text, the phrase rulers of this age is something along the lines of archontes tes ionos, or something like that. I don't know Greek. I'm just
yeah.
so And then all these are terms which turn up in Gnostic literature. The archons are these supernatural rulers who are either some kind of evil angels who are commanded by Yaldabaoth, who is the evil version of the God of Israel, or the regular version of the God of Israel for the Gnostics. And so yeah, that's I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up in many of the Gnostic, or that many of the Gnostics would find inspiration in this passage to develop their beliefs.
Yeah. And it's actually something that some of the scholars of some of the people who sort of are focusing on Marcion and Valentinus and sort of the big name Gnostics are starting to make the argument that perhaps part of the reason why we have Paul so prominently in the canon, and even perhaps the reason why we have Luke in the canon, is because the Gnostics, many of whom were sort of these Gentile converts or the children of Gentile converts, were really super into Paul because, Paul is, Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles, right? And it's true, historically, Paul was the guy who was going out there and was like, okay, we can pick up all these, we can pick up a lot of these Gentiles real easy, right? So that basically, that was initially Paul's fan base, if you will, was the Gentile converts, many of whom end up being attracted to Gnosticism, so that when what becomes the Orthodox Church is trying to kind of keep everybody in, one of the ways to do that is by bringing in Paul, who's the guy that they like, and Luke, which is the gospel that they like, and saying, okay, you guys can have a place, you guys can still have a place at the table. Your stuff can still go into the canon too. You just have to forget all this weird crap about Yaldabaoth, because quit trying to make archons a thing, right? We're not going to let you do that. But you can have Luke and you can have Paul because they're basically okay, which I think is interesting to me because in a way that's a very Jewish way of thinking about the canon. Because, one of the things that, people will always bring up, there's all kinds of terrible stuff in the Talmud. The Talmud is awful, blah, blah, blah. No, the Talmud records all of the arguments, even the parts of the arguments that people at the time thought were bad arguments and never actually applied this guy's reasoning. But his part of the argument gets recorded. And I think that that's kind of, at least looks to me like that's kind of what's one of the things that's going on in the formation of the Christian canon as it ends up happening, is it's we're going to put in everybody's version of the story, even if there are contradictions, because what matters is preserving what our whole community thinks.
I mean, not you said the Talmud, but that's also true in the Torah and the other writings.
Yeah, exactly.
There's two times, two different explanations of David meeting Saul.
Yeah.
Why they don't make sense together, but we have both of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's something that you see in a lot of ancient writing in general, where you'll have people will include things. This is a story that I heard about what people do in Ireland.
Mhm.
for example, shows up in Strabo's geography. And he even says, I don't think that this is true, but this is what I got. This is what some guy told me that some guy told him, and I'm putting it in here because this is what I got. And I think that, now there's kind of there's kind of a feeling that you shouldn't write it down unless you're pretty sure it's true.
It's a very modern way of thinking about history.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the problem we have with
Yeah.
scripture. Our idea of
Yeah. Well, and also we don't have this, and also it's easier for us to preserve information. So like we can preserve the raw data and then people can go back and keep looking at the raw data in a way that just wasn't an option even 100 years ago. But anyway, okay, so we are getting way far away from Matthew. And there's a lot of Matthew to get.
there is a lot of Matthew. Oh my
There's
goodness.
a lot of
There's
Matthew.
a lot of Matthew. Oh, by the way, the Anglican lectionary is completely different today.
Oh, it is?
Completely different.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Good to
It,
know.
it was the Transfiguration from Matthew.
Huh.
And then Moses being entered into a cloud of glory from Exodus.
Huh. Yeah. Well, we're going to get some transfiguration, but not yet.
We'll get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, the do not think I have come to abolish the law and the prophets bit is something that there's been a lot of ink spilled over. Like for example, the Jesus seminar, I'm just going to hold this up, is like, yeah, we don't think Jesus actually said that. And basically their reasoning is that and this is kind of a slightly older strata of like the scholarship on the historical Jesus, was wanting to look at Jesus as like a super radical reformer who really did want to get rid of most of the Jewish law. And that later on, Matthew, of course, the author of Matthew, who, may or may not have been the Apostle Matthew, but we're just going to call him Matthew because we got to call him something. Matthew, in their telling of things, then goes back and sort of inserts this material almost as a commentary that makes it sound like Jesus is a lot cooler with the law than they think than the historical Jesus actually was. That view has changed quite a bit, mostly as the result of a lot of scholarship by people who are actually familiar with first century Judaism, who are saying, no, Jesus, whatever else you want to say about him, is completely legible as a first century rabbi. If you're interested in finding out more about this, there's a rabbi named Daniel Rutenberg who has a really great website and mailing list called Life is a Sacred Text that's just really cool in a lot of ways. But she, as a thought experiment, did this whole thing where she like lays out this perfect argument that like Jesus is part of the school of Hillel. like Jesus, yeah, and she like pulls quotes from the Talmud that are and sets them like right next to quotes from Jesus in scripture, and it's like it's like they're rephrasing each other. And because of that, there's sort of a growing consensus that, no, Jesus expected at least his Jewish followers to continue following the law. And basically, the real question was always over, are Gentile followers of Jesus required to follow the law? And of course, the other thing that is going on in here, and this is a this is like seriously like a post-Vatican II thought in Catholic theology. But basically, the idea that when Jesus says, I'm not going to abolish the law and the prophets, that essentially what that means is that the old covenant, or what Christians would call the old covenant, the deal that God made with the Jews, is still in effect. So basically, Jews don't need to convert, they shouldn't be persecuted, you shouldn't say, nasty anti-Semitic things about them, because they have a perfectly valid covenant with God. And as long as they're fulfilling their covenant, that's that, like, they have their own arrangement with God, and we don't understand it. We're just glad that we get to eat bacon, right? Like, we don't have to give up our carnitas. Okay, cool. Jesus did us a solid. We're not going to question it. And, if they want to live according to their ancestral covenant, have fun. If y'all, decide that, you don't want to have to fast all day on Yom Kippur, come on down, the door's open. But if you're happy being a Jew, you do you. And that's, basically and that's kind of like the core of like Catholic of Catholic ecumenical dialogue in general, is like, basically, we're doing it the easiest way and the best way, but it's not necessarily the only way. It's just, why wouldn't you want to do it the best way? Because I mean, do you really want to have, it's like, basically, it's like, do you really want to follow the Torah all the way? Because like, that's hard. Just like, be Catholic, it's easier. Just, so and obviously there's a way of saying that is still kind of offensive to Jews who, they're like, no, actually being Jewish kind of rocks, thank you. So please don't make it sound like, we're like, that we're doing all this unnecessary stuff that, is no good. But at the same time, it also, from a Christian point of view, opens up a lot of like, we just don't have to worry about, like, there's a lot that you don't have to worry about if you believe that the old covenant is still valid.
Yeah.
So, I'm willing to argue that it's at least a very big step in the right direction. So anyway, so that's kind of the, you know, modern Catholic reading of that. And then of course, you know, and then of course the argument then becomes that what Jesus is saying is, okay, so you're a Christian, you know, so you don't have to follow like the dietary rules, right? But in exchange for being able to kiss your wife while she's on your period, while she's on her period, I've got some demands. And basically the demands are having to adhere to the ethical part of the teaching of the law, which is not necessarily any easier than like just following the law, right? It's just hard in a different way. So this is why I want to know, okay, what does Raqa mean? RAQA in the Latin alphabet. So, because whoever says to his brother Raqa shall be answerable to the Sanhedrin.
Okay, so this is one of the scattered Aramaic phrases. It is interesting to notice that the any kind of phrases in some other language in the Gospels, they are Aramaic and not Hebrew. So that is one of the reasons as to why the scholars think that Jesus spoke Aramaic and not Hebrew. So the word Raqa has a cognate in Hebrew, which is rek, and they both mean like empty or vacuum. So when you say to your brother Raqa, you're just saying that they are dumb or that they are empty-headed, and that is that is one of the reasons as to why is brought up. And so I was checking on the background of this. I was trying to find any references into the in rabbinic literature, and there's this saying in one of the treatises from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the earliest codification of the Jewish law after the Bible, and it was then expanded into what most people would recognize as the Talmud. So the interesting thing is that in this part of the Talmud, they say that whoever offends a person by calling them names is as if they had spilled blood. And regarding this passage in particular, you may see that Jesus says something. So it was said to your ancestors such and such, but I say to you, and then he turns it up a notch. So if you do not commit adultery, then he says, do not even get angry. So he's just trying to be more strict in that sense. And that is the reason that he says that whoever says to his brother Raqa will be answerable to the Sanhedrin. In Jewish law, even though it wasn't, you would not receive any kind of penalty for calling your brother Raqa. In this case, Jesus is encouraging to be more strict and to treat any kind of disrespect to your brother as something that would be answerable to the Sanhedrin. And you can see it in this whole passage.
Yeah. Exactly. And then also now his and then of course I just yeah, now, and I also wanted to bring up the whole settle with your opponent quickly while on the way to court. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, I say to you, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. Now, this is kind of now this is where we get into, like, specifically Catholic nonsense, because this is one of the pieces of scripture that gets used when people are trying to figure out the logic behind purgatory, right? So the idea here is that the person is making a sin offering. So they've repented and they've made things right with God, but they still have to make things right with their brother. And the idea then becomes that if they don't do that, they still have to pay some kind of a penalty to the judge. And this is what gets used to become the doctrine of purgatory. So it's the idea that you've sinned, you've repented, so therefore you're not going to go to hell, but you might still have to pay for it. And you might even have to pay for it. And this is where purgatory comes in. You might even have to pay for it after you're dead. So it's not this. So this is why, like, from the Catholic point of view, the idea of, like, oh, a mass murderer had a deathbed confession and therefore they're not going to hell. Because the Catholic answer to that is, well, yeah, but they might have still gone to purgatory. And you can be in purgatory for a really long time. Like back in the day when they were still, like, attaching, like, periods of time to like the spiritual benefits of different prayers. It's like you say this prayer and it knocks off like 500 years of purgatory. So you kind of get the idea that purgatory is being imagined on a, like, glacial, geologic kind of time scale. And that, I suspect, is part of the reason why when they were going through Jesus is intensifying the requirements of the law, specifically the one that they picked up on was the one that also kind of reinforces the doctrine of purgatory. Because, of course, if you're an audience, if you're a member of the congregation and you're already predisposed to believe in purgatory and you hear this passage, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, checks out.
I was unaware that this was one of the purgatory verses.
Yeah, this is one of the purgatory verses. Yeah.
Completely. Yeah. I mean, this is generally in Protestant circles interpreted as that disputes inside the church must be resolved inside the church instead of taken to civil courts, which, as an interpretation, I feel like there's some interpretations like, okay, yeah, I shouldn't try to sue my brother. I should go to him and talk to him, and we should resolve it. If we need to get somebody else to help mediate inside the church, we should do that. Which I think is actually a good place to start, definitely. But sometimes it can be lean into keeping things that should go to a legal, should be handed by to just, do not pass go, doesn't need to go to the pastor, it needs to go straight to the police. That's where it usually goes awry in Protestant circles.
Right. Well, and also it's worth, pointing out that this story is imagining that the person who's being spoken to is legally in the wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And in some sense knows that they're in the wrong. So it's like, instead of going to court and getting a harsher punishment, just just fix things before it goes to that point.
Definitely.
You know, which honestly is not the worst advice.
Own up to the mistake and fix it.
Yeah, own up.
Honestly, it's great. It's great. Great advice.
Yeah, own up to your mistake and fix it. Don't make them take you to court to get their money back because you know you cheated them.
Don't make your friends say something to you if you know that you messed up. Just
Yeah.
go and apologize.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're right. It'll be okay. Start
Exactly.
there.
Yeah, it's just really, yeah. It's like the way that it will sometimes get expressed is that it's not creating a system of lawlessness, it's creating a system in which law is unnecessary because people just do what they're supposed to do, which, you know, is I kind of feel like the worst that you can say about that is it's kind of hopelessly utopian.
Well, isn't the kingdom of heaven a utopia?
Yes,
Isn't
exactly.
that what we're hoping and
Yeah.
planning for?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, and then of course we get to the whole, you know, the whole you know, looking at a woman with lust, which, you know, famously got Jimmy Carter into problems. Because they gave him because he gave an interview in which they asked him if he had ever been unfaithful to his wife, which he had not. But, you know, being a, you know, good sola scriptura Protestant, he said, but I have committed adultery in my heart. In that, you know, apparently he had at one point looked at a pretty girl walking down the street and felt a certain kind of way.
Yeah, that this is a verse that gets leans into the purity culture of my youth, and it was not great
Yeah.
because
And
took it a little it was just interpreted incredibly strictly
yes.
and in a way that was just not particularly helpful.
Right. And
The idea that you could look at like your first thought being you know,
yeah.
making you an unrepentant sinner is like, well,
Yeah.
come on.
And it's worth pointing out that this is something where, like, the way that lust is being thought of, it's not is that in you know, first century Judea, lust wasn't being thought of as just like, you know, the like internal stirrings of sexual desire.
Mm-hmm.
Lust was like actively imagining yourself performing certain kinds of acts, or, you know, or thinking, you know, well, if I killed that woman's husband, then I could marry her.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, like sort of plotting in your head what you would do and how you would do it. It's more than just, you know, I looked at someone
Ooh,
and I felt,
pretty.
yeah, and I felt a certain kind of way. Or even I looked at someone and I thought, you know, if it were appropriate for me to do certain things with that person, there are certain things that I would very much like to do with that person, assuming that they were into it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of, so there's a lot, so there is a certain amount of wiggle. What I'm trying to say is that there actually is a certain amount of wiggle room in what's being called lust. And there's a way of reading these passages that, you know, doesn't necessarily have to result in teenagers whose bodies are full of hormones being made to feel bad about the fact that they are teenagers whose bodies are filled with hormones. Um, and then of course, you know, and it was decided fairly early on that all of the stuff about cutting off body parts was a metaphor. What do you guys, you guys really need to calm down a little bit, because it's pretty well known that one of the reasons why Origen is not a saint, as much as everybody still reads Origen, is because Origen chose to make himself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And by that, I mean that Origen is reputed to have taken a knife and cut off certain parts of his anatomy that he felt were going to cause him to sin. And that's not and the church had decided that that's not something that needed to be encouraged.
Oh, so that's why he's not a saint. That's interesting. I
Yeah.
would have thought. I mean,
Yeah.
there are so many other saint stories about extreme
Yeah.
behaviors.
Yeah, but they all tend to stop at like actual permanent self-mutilation. They generally don't involve actual permanent self-mutilation. So, you know, kind of, you know, like I've mentioned, you know, previous to this, the Catholic Church actually has a rightward boundary, right? So,
Hmm.
in the particular case of asceticism, the line is you can't mutilate yourself. You can't like deliberately do something that's going to cause like permanent physical harm to your body. And historically, people who have tried to do that have kind of had the hierarchy go, no,
Hmm.
you know, don't do that. I mean, even, you know, for example, people who develop stigmata, which is something that has happened occasionally where someone on their body will develop wounds of like physical wounds that do not heal, that are in at least some of the places that Jesus would have been wounded during the crucifixion. And one of the things that they always look at is the person doing it to themselves?
Mm.
Right? Is there a possibility that this is somebody who is imitating Jesus way too far? And that's why they have these signs on their body. So that's why it got decided pretty early on that cutting off your hand is a metaphor.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was one of the points of discussion during the Council of Nicaea, right?
Um, I don't remember if it was Nicaea, but it was one of the church councils that they very specifically decided that eunuchs cannot become priests.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it was at least if it wasn't Nicaea, it was around Nicaea. But yeah, there was very early, like no mutilation became a rule. Um, and you know, and of course, you know, much ink has been spilled since then, both by scholars and by Catholics who are interested in extreme forms of self-mutilation. If the if that decision of no, cutting off your hand is a metaphor, are you nuts, happened because basically that was the kind of thing that in the Roman Empire was way too weird and would not have been tolerated. So that basically telling people to not cut their hands off was essentially respectability politics. And so therefore, it really is okay to, cut off body parts.
Well, I mean, isn't there a certain element to the demographic of much of the early church would have been people who really simply could not have afforded to do that?
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. Yeah. Well,
Like
yeah,
they literally, if they don't have hands,
they're
either
not going to eat. Right,
they're
right.
not going to eat, yeah.
Yeah.
Or they're enslaved and then they've just damaged their master's property and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not going to end well.
Well, exactly. I mean, like I say, that there are lots of very good reasons for making the institutional decision that, when Jesus says to cut off your hand, he doesn't really mean to cut off your hand, people. Like there's lots of reasons why you would say that,
You saying that I should not read the Bible literally.
I'm saying that I'm saying that religious practices should be safe, sane, and consensual. That's what I'm saying. And
Fair enough.
I think that most people can agree that gouging out eyes and cutting off hands is not safe or quite probably sane. Now, just the other thing that I wanted to highlight, because this gets us into like, this is in here for very specific Catholic reasons that are worth pointing out, because it also gets into sort of modern church history, where and I would note that the line the workbook that I have actually includes stage directions for some of the passages. And so it says, pronounce this line slowly and emphatically. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, and then there's a dash, unless the marriage is unlawful, and another dash, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I would like to point out that most translations put the word in the dash, whoever divorces his wife except for adultery. And they've chosen to use a slightly less literal translation, which is unless the marriage is unlawful. And the reason for this is purely Catholic inside baseball. Because prior to the 1960s, the position of the Catholic Church was that once you were married, you were married. At least if you had a marriage, and pretty much the only wiggle room was for people who had gotten civilly married, but had not actually been married in the Catholic Church. Those people could sometimes get an annulment. Or if you could like actually prove that, like, for example, like if somebody had actually been told you have to get up there and say I do, or we're going to kill your grandma, right? But it would have to be like that level of coercion to get an annulment.
Mm-hmm.
Unless of course you were a king and could just give the Pope a giant chest of gold and say that marriage wasn't valid, was it? And then sometimes the Pope would say, your chest of gold is remarkably persuasive. And of course, also, if you had enough money to, hand the Pope a chest of gold, you also had enough money to hire a really smart canon lawyer who could find like some little itty bitty technical thing to let you off on, right? Also, prior to the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae, it was understood that the primary purpose of marriage was to produce children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, as long as the two people in the marriage had gone into the marriage saying, we're going to try to be a family and we're going to try to raise whatever kids we have, then that's a valid marriage, whether or not they particularly like each other, whether or not they particularly like each other 5-10 years down the road. So you would have situations where, say, there was abuse in a marriage, where it might be okay for the couple to live separately, but they couldn't actually get a divorce and they couldn't actually remarry. That changes in like when Humanae Vitae comes out, because Humanae Vitae says in very clear terms that the primary purpose of marriage is for these two people to have a family. Like they are each other's people, they are each other's partners, and part of that is because when a man and a woman love each other very much and they give each other a special hug and they aren't using contraception, certain things happen as a result of that, right? Which, one of which is, if you're not using contraception, is frequently, the proverbial 80 billion Catholic babies. There's currently a lot of negotiation going on can a couple lawfully do things that can't make a baby if they're married? That's being debated way above my pay grade. The people, I'm Tuco, I'm staying quiet about this one, right? But the point is that reformulation in Humanae Vitae also meant that consent to the marriage became defined a lot more strictly, right? So the idea becomes that, a couple, if they say, if they go into the marriage for like any reason other, if it's like, well, like, for example, people in the US will get married because they want to put somebody on, they need to put the person on their health insurance. Or even, you get married because, the bride is pregnant. And, as my grandma would put it, well, they had to get married, right? Like that was the phrase that was used if a couple got married because of a pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Was, well, they had to get married. And like, and like, and even when like my mom and dad got married very young. My mom was like just 18. I wasn't born for like 2 years later. And my grandma would always like point that out to like people in the town when they mention, oh yeah, your daughter's, like 18, she's getting married. Isn't that awful young? And she'd say, well, it wasn't like they had to get married. Right. So it was like, it was still respectable, right? They didn't have to get married.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, now, like the Catholic Church will say, well, you didn't get married because you wanted to get married, right? So therefore, the reason why the marriage didn't work out is because, you know what? You went into it with good intentions, but it just wasn't a valid marriage. And it was never a valid marriage, and it didn't become a valid marriage over time. So therefore, we're just going to let you loose. So you go from 1963, I actually looked this up. There were like less than 400 annulments granted worldwide, right? In the year 2000, there were 100,000 annulments granted just in the US. And yeah. And then when Francis became Pope, because and this was partly due to his experience in Argentina, because for a very long time, Argentina didn't allow even civil divorce. So you had situations where a marriage would break up, and then, you know, like people would get married very, very young. The marriage would break up, and then they would, you know, have a second, you know, what was effectively a second marriage, right? Only the kids had no legal rights because they were born outside of marriage. And Francis was like, this is bullshit. So he set it up so that now the annulment process is as streamlined as possible and is as close to free as is humanly possible. So, like, now getting an annulment is pretty reasonable. And that's basically the way that the Catholic Church has chosen to square the circle on not allowing divorce, but also not forcing people to stay in relationships that they don't want to be in, or by not allowing people to remarry. It's basically turning it into a paperwork problem where it's just saying, okay, you know, this relationship fell apart. Was it ever a marriage to start with? And if the answer is no, then you can just say, okay, you're free to move on. You weren't married. And there are a lot of Catholics who have gotten a civil divorce who have found, you know, that annulment process and being told, you know, no, it wasn't your fault, right? It just, you thought you were doing the right thing and it just wasn't a marriage. You know, I'll find that very freeing. But anyway, that's why, but I just wanted to draw people's attention to that, because that's like a very like specific, because like that's like a very specific, like, you only care about this if you're Catholic, and if you're not listening for it, you're not going to realize that he just said whoever divorces his wife except for adultery is now getting read out as whoever divorces his wife unless the marriage is unlawful.
Yeah, that's not.
Yeah.
I don't think any of the Bibles in my house read that way.
Yeah. Well, the only Bibles, the only Bible in my house that says it is the Catholic edition of the RSV. And it'll actually be really interesting to see what the Catholic edition of the NRSV says. Because the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops just announced that next year they're going to be publishing a Catholic approved version of the NRSV, which famously is the one that has like generic sexual immorality in Paul, which had, and as we can imagine, sexual immorality is a little bit of a moving target, or at least is a little bit squishier of a category than the way that, say, the ESV translates it, where it's like specifically homosexual behavior. So anyway, that's kind of all I had for Matthew. I did want to note that that the part about Rakah in the Jesus seminar even is in blue, and pretty much the only reason why they were willing to give any credence to that passage at all was specifically because it has that little piece of Aramaic in there. Because basically, an idea that shows up in a lot of critical scholarship is essentially the idea that the parts of the Bible that are actually Aramaic are more likely to, if not be the actual words of Jesus, have a tighter connection to an authentic thing that Jesus actually said, rather than some of the things that really only make sense when they're written in Greek. That you couldn't even, because there are some passages that you couldn't even necessarily imagine what this would have sounded like in Aramaic. Whereas when we have a little, drop of Aramaic in there, it makes you think, oh, maybe that's why. Because why else would you bother to preserve the Aramaic, especially in a document that's being composed in Greek?
It makes sense and perhaps another idea which is underlying that preserving of the words in Aramaic is that in some sense his words in Aramaic have power, and that is why they were meant to be preserved.
Right. And again, but the fact also that we have these random Aramaic words, to me, is kind of yet another reason why I think that Jesus mythicism is just silly. Because at a certain point, it's like, okay, so you're going to build up this secret cult around a Mediterranean rising and dying god, and you're going to have him be crucified, and you're going to say he was the Jewish Messiah, and you're going to say that there was something like hinky around his birth, right? And you're going to throw in random Aramaic phrases into your composed in Greek scriptures. I mean, you kind of hit the point of that seems like an awful lot of work. It's just at this point, it's like, why would people decide that, yeah, this is the weird Mediterranean religion that I'm going to sign up for? Whereas if you think about it as, this is a movement that is kind of made up of, these weirdo Jews who've decided that Jesus was the Messiah, who are now going around and telling all these Gentile converts, hey, you can totally be part of the cool kids club, and you don't have to follow all of the legal restrictions. We figured out how to make the math problem work. And you have all these Gentiles are like, cool, sign me up. To me, as a from what I know about the way that like intellectual movements spread in general, that version makes a lot more sense. You know, it requires less people cackling in small rooms. So anyway, that pretty much is everything I had to say. Did anyone have any closing thoughts before the parish announcements?
No.
Nope.
Okay, so next Wednesday we will be coming up with we'll have a pre-recorded video airing that will just be talking about a little bit about the way that Lent is observed in the modern world, and also kind of how we ended up deciding that that everybody should fast and be sad for the first the 40 days before Easter. We also on Monday, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Shelley Rabinovich about Catholic folk shrines. And that video is edited and is being edited and will be coming up next week. And then on Thursday, Dapper cannot join us because he will be preparing for the Cambrian Bunny Awards, which is the big thing on his channel where they announce the best, worst, and other categories relating to young Earth creationists. I plan on tuning in for that, but prior to the Cambrian Bunny Awards, we will also be talking a little, we're going to be taking a break from yelling at Christians for Christians. And we instead are going to be talking about the current drama concerning the Society of St. Pius X, because there is no drama as good as religious drama. So if you want to hear some like really good Catholic drama with like dueling excommunications and like death threats, revenge, backstabbing, it's got it all. So we will be going over the current issues with the SSPX and the Vatican. And Strickland, Bishop Strickland, who we will also be yelling at, is part in our Christians for Christians series, is part of that drama. And we also have a prominent appearance in the most recent phase to Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, otherwise known as Tuco, the hero and friend of Nerd Church. So we've got a action-packed week coming up, and then of course we'll be back at 4 p.m. on Sunday for the first Sunday of Lent. So have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.